All right. 2 Samuel chapter 11. Have you found that yet? 2 Samuel chapter 11 in verse 1 says this, that in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, notice that right there. Every little phrase of every Bible story is very integral. God doesn't give you this background detail for no reason. When He gives you background information, He's telling you an amazing amount in a very short amount of time. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Would you repeat that last sentence with me? But David remained in Jerusalem. David remained in Jerusalem. Now, the Bible already tells us that where David ought to have been, where he was supposed to be, was with his men, at least at this time. Now, I'm sure David had 1,000 great excuses. Anybody in here have any good excuses? We've all got good excuses, don't we? Sure we do. I'm sure David had 1,000 great excuses as to why he needed to stay home. We all need to stay home. You think David was a busy guy? He's king, for heaven's sakes. Who thinks a king has probably got a few things on his plate? He's got a few things. And if you know the Bible story, well, you know he has children. At this time, his young children. If you've got young children, you got a lot of duties. You got a lot of good excuses to stay home, right? Well, I'm sure David had some good excuses to stay home. But this story, and we'll read a little bit more here in just a minute, represents the turning point in David's life. Everything, literally everything up to this point in David's story was an amazing history of God protecting him, God keeping him, God delivering him. It's probably the greatest rags to riches story in the history of the world. David and Goliath, God just supernaturally coming through for David and protecting him. And we just see David on this amazing climb from shepherd to king as God promotes him and God blesses him and God protects him. Seemingly no matter what comes against him, nothing can overthrow him. But from this point on, his life story changes. Things take a turn for the dark side. From this point on, the very next stories, if we had time, we don't have time today, if you had time to read the rest of the stories, just following this, from this time, the very next story in the Bible is David's own flesh and blood, his son raping his own half-sister, which would have been David's daughter. Then the brother of that half-daughter, another of David's sons, he had more than one wife, you understand, killed that brother. So one of David's sons has raped his daughter. Another of David's sons has now killed that son. That's the next story. The next story after that is a third of David's sons rallying the people of Israel against David and resulting in civil war. From this point on, really the rest of David's life story is darkness and amazing trial, amazing. How many know that's a tough day when your one son kills another son? We've all had bad news, but that is pretty tough to take. And then civil war, your own people rising up against you. And the Bible makes very clear, and I think that you really miss it to see that this entire story hinges on one point. And I think if we'd be able to think back in our own life as to times where we've made some mistakes, it's come in a similar position like this. Where is David when he makes this mistake? Anybody remember? Where is David? He's at home alone. Everybody say home alone. Now, maybe I'm sure his family was around there, but somehow or another, he was not where he's supposed to be. He's not with his people where he's supposed to be. David remained in Jerusalem. Let's see what happens when David remains in Jerusalem. Let's see what happens when he stays home, when he's supposed to be with his people. Verse 2, one evening, David got up from his bed, walked around on the roof of his palace. By the way, would he have been there had he been where he's supposed to be? No, he wouldn't even be here if he was where he's supposed to be. He gets up from his bed, walks around the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. I hope you know this, friends, that there is a real devil. There really is. Some people say, oh, come on. There is a real devil. You wouldn't even need a Bible to figure that out. Just look at this world and the way things fall apart and the way people fall apart and the amazingly wicked things people do. They're influenced, friends. There is a devil. There's a real devil, and I hope you know this. He has traps set for you. He has traps set for your family. He has traps set for your children. But you better realize this, that about 99% of his traps only work when he gets you alone. And there's a fact. His traps, he's got to get you off by yourself. Or at least secluded from the people God has you with. That's the way it works. He has to get you by yourself. Satan obviously has the trap set for David here. Verse 3, David sent someone to find out about her, but the man said, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Verse 4, then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him. He slept with her. Then she went back home. Verse 5, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. We don't have time to read the rest of the story. I think most of you probably know the rest of the story as David sends her husband into battle to be killed. And again, from that point on, the story of David's life turns. But it all hinges at one point, and I think we'd be remiss to not go back and look at this again. Back in verse 1, at the springtime, a time when kings go off to war, David was supposed to have been, and God makes sure that we see this, that at a time when he was supposed to be with his men, a time he was supposed to be with his people, he finds an excuse. I'm sure it was a good one. I'm sure it was an excellent excuse that David found to stay home. And staying home was the beginning of the end of his glory days in his life. I found this quote this past week, and it seemed maybe a little bit rough, but I just have to read this because it's so amazingly fitting. From an old and wise pastor. He says that when you find a principle, again, this is his quote, when you find a principle of nature that is absolute and has never changed, you can be sure that you have learned something about God's ways of running the universe. And then he's going to show us one of these universal principles. Universal among the animal kingdom is the fact that all predators attack the loner. No matter how strong or powerful a predator is, it always will go for the easiest meal. And spiritually, things are no different. The Bible speaks of Satan as the devourer, and it seems to me that his teeth mainly go after the stray sheep. Over the years, now again, this is an old pastor talking about what he's seen over many, many years. He pastored a very large congregation. Over the years, what started as suspicions in my mind have become so clear to me that now I feel I can predict people's success with God and in life. The people who end up happy and successful have vital and real relationships with several other people in the church. I have yet to see the example of the person who remained faithful to God and had fruitful, happy lives who kept to themselves. What I have watched thousands of times over these many years is people who chose to keep to themselves, dried up spiritually, and these were normally the ones who experienced the true disasters of life. Now, he's not saying this, but I would say those are the very same similar type disasters. I mean, what David went through, I would call a disaster. There's one that we all go through a hard time, but what David experienced would be a disaster. And I think that's what this man is speaking of, the true disasters. And then he goes on to say this. He says, while I can count on one hand the financial bankruptcies of church members who are vitally involved in relationships, I have lost count of the hundreds I have seen of the loners. Divorces, diseases, and all other disasters seem to follow the same pattern. I have two main theories as to why it works this way. All right, now here we're going to hear his theories. Number one, God has ordained that much of the little bits of information and boosts of energy needed to keep being successful come directly through His people, and they will come in no other way. If we avoid God's people, we simply never get the needed course corrections and sail straight into disaster. Now, if you'll allow me, I want to take just a minute or two and talk about that. He goes right on, but that is so amazingly huge, because that is exactly what happens. God has ordained that a huge amount of the corrections we need in life. How many know that you need corrections on occasion? If you're going to go a straight line down the road, they say, we use the Bible illustration of on the straight and narrow. When you drive down a straight road, do you realize that you're constantly making little corrections? There's no such thing. You can't just set it in cruise control, get in the back seat and take a nap, can you? You can't do that. And you can't do that in life. What's going to happen if you try to set it in cruise control and get in the back seat? What's going to happen? You're going to have a huge crash, aren't you? Well, it's the same in life. To stay on the straight and narrow, it's not as easy as just making a decision to sticking with it. There's constant course corrections needed. And we're talking about all areas of your financial life, your family life, the joy and the peace you have in your soul. To stay on that straight and narrow, there's going to need to be 1,000 little course corrections. How do those course corrections come to you? Well, I wish we had time. We could share you 100 different scriptures. The Bible says, one of them says in Psalms 133, that where brothers dwell together in unity, it's there that God commands His blessing. Unity is more than we're just not fighting. Unity means that you have relationships, you know people, you love people, you're sharing yourself with people. God says that in that place, that's where He protects. That's where He